Good morning in the US and good evening in Indonesia. I'm David Merrill, president of USINDO, the US-Indonesia Society. Welcome to today's open forum held by USINDO and the Asia Society Policy Institute, featuring a conversation between our USINDO co-chair, Ambassador Bob Blake, and renowned Indonesian former Foreign Minister, Dr. Marty Natalegawa, Distinguished Fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute. This program is intended to give us a more in-depth appreciation of the significant foreign policy challenges and opportunities Indonesia is now facing, as this year, as most of you know, Indonesia is president of the G20, and next year it becomes the chairman of ASEAN. Today's program has attracted over 230 listeners, including the heads of 3 Washington-based Asia-related organizations, the US-ASEAN Business Council, the East-West Center, and the Simpson Center's Southeast Asia Forum. I now invite Alina Noor, Director of Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, to give her a welcome. Alina.
Thank you, Mr. Merrill. The Asia Society Policy Institute is proud to collaborate on this event with USINDO, featuring ASPI Distinguished Fellow Dr. Marty Natalegawa. Indonesia's leadership role, not only in ASEAN, but particularly this year of the world with its presidency of the G20, has and will see the characteristic creativity of its diplomacy amid challenging developments in the background. Dr. Natalegawa, of course, is a towering figure, and we're thrilled to have this time today.
This year, Indonesia's diplomacy faces challenges of a kind it has not seen in generations. One might have to go back even to the 1960s to get something this weighty of a challenge for Indonesia. Its presidency of the G20, now occurring in the year of the Russia-Ukraine war, has given rise to widely varying views among G20 members about the circumstances under which they will attend and who else should attend. At the same time, the G20 meeting is a crucial opportunity to address a host of global economic, climate, and technology issues, to which, unfortunately, must now be added the war's huge impact on world food supplies. So those who say the G20 should restrict itself to economic issues and not war or political issues seem to have to face up to the fact that the war is causing global economic issues. Beyond the G20 this year, Indonesia will also have the opportunity to deftly position itself when it takes over the ASEAN chairmanship next year, a subject about which Dr. Natalegawa has written extensively. This chairmanship will take place against the backdrop of intensifying major power relations and the Indo-Pacific's evolving strategic architecture, as well as a range of regional economic organizations and structures, some of which were announced in the last couple of years, some of which were announced in the last couple of weeks. Regarding today's panelists, there is no one better qualified than former Foreign Minister Dr. Marty Natalegawa to enlighten us on these issues. He was Indonesia's foreign minister from 2009 to 2014. Before that, he was Indonesia's ambassador and representative to the United Nations, ambassador to the UK, served in many other key foreign ministry positions. He's been called, quote, one of the most respected foreign policy and international security thinkers of his generation, both within Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, and in the broader Asia-Pacific region, unquote. He was an early advocate of an ASEAN role in the Indo-Pacific through the concept of dynamic equilibrium. He is the author of Does ASEAN Matter? A View from Within. He has actively promoted the management and resolution of potential conflicts in the region. He serves on several distinguished boards dealing with foreign policy, mediation, and disarmament, including being chair of the Asia Pacific Leaders Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. He earned his PhD from the Australian National University, his master's from Cambridge University, and his bachelor's degree from the London School of Economics. Dr. Natalegawa has been awarded several of Indonesia's highest medals, and in 2012 was knighted by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Ambassador Bob Blake. While Bob Blake may not yet have achieved knighthood, he has an extremely distinguished career. He served for 31 years in the State Department in a wide range of leadership positions. And as most of us know, from 2013 to 2016, he was U.S. Ambassador to Indonesia, where he gave priority to building stronger bilateral business and educational ties and developing cooperation to help Indonesia reduce greenhouse gas emissions, an objective that he continues to work on today. Previously, he served as Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, for which he was awarded the State Department's Distinguished Service Award. Before that, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Sri Lanka and the Maldives, where we first met. Earlier, he was Deputy Chief of Mission in India, where he was named the Worldwide DCM of the Year. He's also served in several other countries, Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt, and Nigeria. He's currently our co-chair, he's U.S. co-chair of USINDO's board and a board member of the Asia Foundation and the Bhutan Foundation. He holds a BA from Harvard University and an MA from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Today's conversation between Ambassador Blake and Dr. Natalegawa will be 30 to 35 minutes. We'll see how it goes. They can be flexible, of course, if they need to. And it will be followed by audience Q&A through Zoom, which will be moderated by Alina Noor from the Asia Society. Bob, please.
Well, thank you, David, very much for those kind introductions. And let me add my own very warm words of welcome to Pak Marty. When I was ambassador in Jakarta, I often sought his counsel and his appreciation of events that were going on at the time, and he was always extremely generous with his time and his thoughts. So, and let me also, of course, thank the Asia Society Policy Institute and USINDO for arranging this. So, Pak Marty, let's dive right in. Mm-hmm. As Ambassador Merrill said, Asia and indeed the world face a great many challenges today. The war in Ukraine has had wide-ranging impacts, including surges in food and energy and other commodity prices, as well as interest rate hikes in the United States and elsewhere. We've seen momentum from Glasgow on climate slowing and the transition to renewable energy delayed. COVID and the US-China trade war have caused severe supply chain disruptions, and democracy and good governance are on the decline, just to name a few of the challenges. And at the same time, the institutions to deal with these global challenges have been weakened. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has divided the G20 and other international institutions, while the UN Security Council remains divided. So before we broach specific topics, I wondered if you'd like to just make any brief opening comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Blake. I should like to begin by expressing appreciation for the very kind invitation for this conversation this morning in the United States and this evening in Indonesia and the region. And I'd like as well to pay tribute to both ambassadors, Ambassador Merrill and Ambassador Blake, for their sterling service, not only to their own government, their own country, but also in promoting a closer relationship between Indonesia and United States, between Southeast Asia and United States. And of course, not least of all, I'd like to acknowledge Director Elina Noor for making possible today's discussion, and paying tribute as well to ASPI's phenomenal contribution to better understanding with not only of Indonesia and the region, but also of Asia in general in the United States. I mean, to your question, Ambassador Blake, obviously it is the situation that we are facing is a complicated and a truly challenging one. I think you have referred to some of the challenges that is obvious in front of us, and earlier Ambassador Merrill has also highlighted some and of those, and Director Noor as well. But you know, I mean, referencing it to Indonesia's chairmanship or presidency of G20 this year and ASEAN 2023, I'm trying hard to highlight it's actually a time of opportunity, not only a time of challenge. Because even amidst challenge, where if Indonesia is able to come up with the appropriate response, then we can be meaningful and we can be shaping and molding how the world can respond to these matters. From the vantage point of ASEAN, you can close it. From the vantage point of ASEAN, I think if I, at the risk of oversimplification, I see at least like a three-level type of challenge today. You know, one is internal to ASEAN itself, you know, of the type that probably you may raise later on, issues such as development in Myanmar or the general headwinds against democracy in our part of the world. There are, in other words, internal ASEAN issues. Then there is the more traditional issues of the type that Ambassador Merrill mentioned before as well, how ASEAN deals with the so-called geopolitical push and pulls between the major powers. And not least of all, a third layer would be how ASEAN deals with global issues of the pandemic type, of the climate change type. And I agree with you full-heartedly, Ambassador Blake, that there is a challenge to our governance. Probably one can mention a governance deficit, to what extent the institutions that we have are fit for purpose in dealing with these issues. But probably more than actual institutional deficit, what I fear most is, at the risk of oversimplification, of a leadership deficit, in the sense that the reticence to actually employ and deploy or take advantage of the institutions that we already have. Because, you know, I mean, when I think about ASEAN, actually, as a matter of fact, we have, for the most part, the wherewithal already to deal with some of these issues. You know, the ASEAN community initiated as long ago as 2003, was essentially a means to deal or anticipated the type of internal, external nexus that we are grappling with today. The issue of ASEAN, ASEAN initiated processes in the region, East Asia Summit, etc., etc. They are means to deal with the major power rivalry, so to speak, and not least of all the so-called ASEAN in a global community of nations, speaks to the issue of ASEAN needing to work with one another in dealing with these sort of issues. In other words, the governance deficit definitely exists, but more than that, probably what's important is the leadership deficit, whether that is actually a problem that we are having today.
Great. Well, I think that's an excellent framework for our discussion. And let's dig a little deeper into some of the things that you mentioned. Maybe we could start on the economic front. As you know, Pa Marty, President Biden launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which we call IPEF, during his recent visit to Tokyo. And I think we were all very pleased that Indonesia and 6 other ASEAN countries supported the launch, but have not yet formally committed to joining the initiative. everyone, of course, would like to see the United States offer a trade deal and market access, but there is not support in Washington now for either of those options. So I'd be interested how IPEF is being viewed in Indonesia and the region, and what counsel you would have both for the United States and ASEAN as we look ahead on this initiative.
Well, I mean, when I think about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, I think of it not in isolation, but within the wider context of things. I mean, in recent years, we have seen in our part of the world the evolution of a number of similar economic framework, the RCEP, for instance, and the TPP as subsequently revised. And of course, we have APEC as well. And now we have the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework joining, I mean, further congesting the economic architecture. At the moment, to me, Ambassador Blake, there's still a lot of questions, a lot of issues for us to be enlightened on. I see a great deal of internal, not ramifications, but internal dynamics leading to the initiation of this initiative by the United States, and to what extent in United States internal considerations is the driving force for this initiative that I think member states of the region will be reflecting on, especially pondering and wondering to what extent this initiative will be sustained if there were to be subsequent political changes internally within the United States. So I think there is still issues to be informed and to be enlightened on. But again, insofar as ASEAN is concerned, I think, or Indonesia, if I may, obviously what I say is purely my own personal view. Initiative of this type reminds us of the consequence of inaction, really. Because we have, it's not only the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, we have the revitalization of the Quad, we have AUKUS, so-called minilateralism that the United States is now pushing within the Indo-Pacific context. To me, these are natural consequence, not to be criticized, but it is what it is. Natural consequence of ASEAN not employing and utilizing the instruments that they already have. RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, was not a China-led initiative. It was initiated by Indonesia in 2011, and it is supposed to be an ASEAN-led modality. Indonesia initiated it in 2011, and now somehow, although RCEP has come to force, Indonesia has not ratified it. To me, that's a little bit quite mind-boggling to be in that situation. And the other forums, the East Asia Summit, etc. To what extent we have been really employing and making it relevant, but in the absence of such a commitment to use the instruments that we have, then we have the proliferation of such initiatives. I mean, I would have thought, again, having the benefit of non-responsibility on my shoulder, I would have thought it would be great if we expend a great deal of political capital in getting the United States onto the RCEP, for instance, together with China. And I mean, not China, United States. China is already there, obviously, United States and India within RCEP. Then we will have that equilibrium that one has been seeking. But yeah, it is welcome. Apparently, by Indonesia, the launch has been welcome, but there is still a lot to be informed, to what it entails and how sustainable the initiative will be. Fully
Yes.
Understandable and extremely positive, in my view, in terms of signaling the U.S. engagement and commitment in the region, which needs, this kind of initiatives. Obviously, is extremely important. Yeah.
Great. Well, we'll come back to the ASEAN piece of that in a minute. But, I think at its heart, IPEF is all about trying to harmonize rules and standards. And at a time when, the rules-based international order is often fraying, I do think this could be an important opportunity, as you say. Do you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely, and it's quite unique as well. My understanding is that you have those 1, 2, 3, 4 areas, and countries can choose to opt in some of the areas, not the entire 4 pillars, so to speak, which I think is rather interesting approach, because normally, when you have this type of frameworks or agreements or processes, it's like all or nothing type of approach. So there is a pragmatic building block, almost functional approach, which I find quite interesting to see. And I get it. This could be precisely the type of 21st century architecture or governance that may be required. One that is that has sufficient flexibility and adaptability, inbuilt adaptability mechanism, and at the same time as well, realistic in terms of the need for domestic internal support, because there's no use to have the most wonderful of and exciting of economic framework if it doesn't get the internal domestic political support. So obviously it is potentially, I think, groundbreaking. And I hope in the weeks to come, I'm sure in the weeks to come, we will hear more of what the US plans are and to have everyone on board. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, our viewers may want to come back to this in the Q&A, but let me move on to the G20. As Ambassador Merrill said, Indonesia will be hosting the G20 summit later this year in Bali. And of course, that will be a great opportunity to highlight Indonesia's progress on many fronts, but really also a very important opportunity, as you say, to mobilize action on global threats like COVID and supply chains and climate and many other things. And so in that respect, it's a test for Indonesian diplomacy, because Indonesia's intention to invite President Putin could very well lead to boycotts by several Western nations. Yeah. As foreign minister, you often had very thoughtful and creative solutions to thorny issues like that. And I wondered if you have any ideas about how Indonesia could pursue the objective of having a successful summit and narrow the divisions that now exist between the West and Russia and China to ensure a positive outcome.
Well, first of all, Ambassador Blake, I think Indonesia's presidency of the G20 really reminds of how precious and how important is the fact that we are part of the G20. I mean, some people nowadays take it for granted that we are among the 20. But there was a time soon after the financial crisis of Indonesia in 1998 and onwards, the idea of Indonesia sitting around the table or within such a institution or such a process would be considered to be out of the question. But because of the reform progress that we have made, the economic development that we have achieved, we have been able from the beginning to be part of the G20. And I think this is extremely important point for Indonesians actually to recognize, and that what is on our shoulder here, it is not only an opportunity, but in this case, I think I would like to emphasize more the element of responsibility for Indonesia. If Indonesia gets it right in the G20, especially given the lack of reform within the United Nations, for instance, this becomes an extremely strategic and an important process. That is why I must say that I was a little bit perplexed and a little bit disappointed personally when at the earlier end of the G20 presidency, in reaction to the development on Ukraine, for instance, the principle, and then this is the point that Ambassador Merrill had mentioned before, the principal reaction was to emphasize that G20 is an economic forum, not one to discuss developments such as Ukraine. But surely in this 21st century, I mean, economic, political, security, social, environment, they're all intertwined. No one, can ever delineate them neatly. They impact on one another. At the very least, developments in the Ukraine has an impact on the global economy. And I'm glad that after perhaps some reflections, the Indonesian government has recalibrated its position. And for instance, through the president's conversation with the president of Ukraine, had extended invitation to the president of Ukraine, however that will be materialized. But at least no longer we in denial as if Ukraine issue is out of bound. In my private conversations, I try to recall back in 2013, Ambassador Blake, Ambassador Merrill, and Bu Nur, when we had the St. Petersburg G20 summit, the issue of Syria was discussed under Russia's presidency of the G20. It was discussed at great length. I remember it very much. It was in one of the working dinner. I didn't attend because it was limited only to the leaders. But even Russia, when it was presiding in the G20, it recognizes political developments of this type has an impact on the economy and therefore gave room for its consideration. Certainly, it is a test for Indonesia's diplomacy. I did mention before, I'm beginning to be a bit more optimistic after the initial rather straight-jacketed approach. A response, we have begun to demonstrate a sense of agility and a more nuanced approach, extending invitation to the president of Ukraine. Extending invitation to the president of Russia is almost inevitable because it is what it is in terms of organizational responsibility. But I think it is not impossible for Bali G20 summit later on to become like a platform where conversation can begin to be had. And like you said, Ambassador Blake, there are modalities in diplomacy that one can employ in terms of informal meetings, informal conversations for this to take place. But I think it is important for Indonesia, first and foremost, to have a script in terms of what can be achieved in Bali, in terms of Ukraine, for instance. But I'm always reminded, whether it be G20 or ASEAN, chairmanship and leadership is not necessarily one and the same. One can chair or preside over an organization, but one can at the same time limit oneself to organizational responsibility to be a good and efficient host. But what is now sorely needed is actually an actual leadership, thought leadership initiatives by Indonesia. And I'm confident, I have hope that Indonesia will not be failing in that responsibility.
Great. Well, again, we might come back to this in the Q&A. I do want to just get to ASEAN, though, because that's equally important now. Indonesia is going to assume the chairmanship of ASEAN for 2023 at a time of really quite substantial challenges for ASEAN. As you know, Pak Marty, a little progress has been made on the ASEAN 5-point plan for Myanmar. China has consolidated its position in the South China Sea and has installed anti-ship missiles and jamming equipment, even as talks on the code of conduct that you worked so hard on have made no progress. And internal ASEAN unity is fragile. So let's unpack some of these. Let's start with Myanmar. Indonesia, I think, has shown quite a lot of leadership in pushing ASEAN to do more on Myanmar. But as I say, there's still a stalemate there. So when it assumes the chair, how would you assess prospects for progress on Myanmar?
Well, yes, Ambassador Blake, you have described well some of the issues or challenges that ASEAN face as Indonesia approaches its chairmanship year next year. All the issues that you have mentioned before, Myanmar, South China Sea, for instance, they are not new issues for ASEAN, unfortunately. They have been like a permanent, almost permanent portfolio in ASEAN's consideration. And the Myanmar issue, for instance, I mean, what I ponder and wonder is whether the developments that we have seen in recent the past, in the post-coup, for instance, would have occurred if ASEAN was a bit more persistent and a bit more steadfast and continuous in nurturing, in hand-holding, in encouraging the democratization process in Myanmar. Democratization is a process, is not an event. And there have been so many informal, above from the limelight process of hand-holding, encouraging, prodding, pressurizing even, as far as Myanmar is concerned, so that they don't, they don't slow down in their democratization process. But in recent years, what I have seen is that within ASEAN, issues of this type become further and further away from ASEAN's discussions. They were talking, I mean, of course, there are issues that are far more of greater concern probably that had preoccupied them. But as far as Indonesia was concerned, although the other 9 may dilute their interest, we in the past, I can only speak of it in the past, we have never taken our eyes off this sort of issues. Myanmar, even the Tatmadaw that at one time had looked at Indonesia's TNI as an example of how an armed forces can reform in a democratic setting. At one time, I said, at one time. But nowadays, I think they're looking elsewhere in our region as an example, and I don't want to mention the country because I don't wish to be to speak ill of any other regional country in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia. But I know that they are looking at the example of the armed forces of elsewhere in Southeast Asia as an example of how they can continue on in their prominent role in society. But in terms of Indonesia and Myanmar itself, this is where I have to be a little bit less. I have to be a bit more thinking through on this, Ambassador Blake, because I get the point. Yes, definitely Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, for instance, have been the most eloquent, the most forthright, the most courageous in speaking up for the need for return for democracy in Myanmar, for the release of Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, etc. I have no doubt about that, and all appreciation to the leaders involved. The Foreign Minister Ibu Retno has been extremely active in this field. My only footnote is this: in the past, whenever we try to project or promote certain ideas within ASEAN, whether it be reform and democracy, good governance, whether it be a foreign policy orientation of ASEAN that is a bit more independent, we do so in a way that at the same time maintain ASEAN unity. So it has to be a very well calibrated, less is more type, sometimes pushing, pressing on the throttle, sometimes pressing on the brake, to make sure that everyone is on board. And we present positions, opinions, and our expectations in a manner that doesn't cause collapse in the entire ASEAN home. Now, what I'm seeing now at the moment is that while individual ASEAN member states, whether it be Indonesia, Myanmar, Malaysia, or Singapore, are able to eloquently express their view on Myanmar, in terms of reform and democracy, the entire ASEAN home is actually perfectly divided. And this is where I think the true challenge for Indonesia is easy, basically, to speak up, what you feel nationally. But how do you do so in a way that at the same time you bring everyone along with you? And this is, I think, the true test of Indonesia's chairmanship next year, because when we become chair of ASEAN, it is not only the national hat that we wear, we have on our but also our chairmanship hat as well. So I hope I'm confident, as a matter of fact, that our policymakers in Indonesia will have the wherewithal, will have the initiative, the thought leadership and ideas to achieve the two objectives all at the same time, not just to speak full of passion and determination on Myanmar itself, but seeing the ASEAN home collapse, but to do both at the same time. We can whistle and walk at the same time.
Thank you. Well, let me follow up on that because you've made some important points there. First, on the question of governance. As you say, there's been a worrying decline in governance across ASEAN. And one of the problems that inhibits ASEAN action on things like this is its doctrine of non-interference. And I've been intrigued that several ASEAN commentators have suggested that ASEAN should modify its doctrine of non-interference by, for example, temporarily expelling Myanmar if it does not cooperate with implementing the 5-point agenda. You know, and another possibility would be for if the ASEAN chair is reluctant for whatever reason to take action on a matter, that you might appoint a troika of countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore to take action on behalf of the organization. I wondered if you thought that those kinds of ideas should be on the table.
You know, I mean, Mr. Blake, this notion of ASEAN vis-a-vis non-interference is something that I had hoped is behind us, is already behind us when we promulgate the idea of an ASEAN community, especially the political security community, because that is precisely the notion that we want to dismiss is as if concern about internal developments among ASEAN, fellow ASEAN member family is somehow inimical to the principle of non-interference. But the principle of non-interference is not only an ASEAN construct. It is a universal, internationally recognizable principle but for all us UN member states. And there's no way that anyone will formally say, any organization will formally say, well, non-interference is no more. We have to set that aside. But what we have been trying to do over so many years is try to instill a third way that we can, on the one hand, respect the principle of non-interference, but at the same time, encourage the notion of political security community in the good governance, respect for human rights, respect for democracy, I mean, promotion of democratic principles. The ASEAN Charter itself embodies the synergy between all these seemingly conflicting claims. But again, those are all on paper. What it has required is actual state practice. And this is where I think has been missing the past 10 years, probably 7, 8 years, I'm not sure. I'm only aware of the past when we, as Indonesia, we deliberately create state practice. Whether anyone asks, any member state of ASEAN ask it of Indonesia, we inform them of developments in Papua, we inform them of developments in Maluku, in Aceh, in other internal conflict situations in ASEAN, simply to begin the habit and set the norms that we can share these issues openly as a fellow members of a common family. And thankfully, at the time, others followed suit. The Philippines with Southern Philippines, Thailand with Southern Thailand, Myanmar on its 7-point roadmap at the time. But once we begin to, ignore, put these issues or this set practice in abeyance, then we are returned back to where we were before 2003, as if it is a black and white, either or, zero sum, etc., etc. And then suddenly, some people say, as if it is a choice, binary choice between respect for non-interference or non-respect. It is possible to do both. And this leads me to your two specific issues. I don't think it's necessarily the consensus decision-making process itself, because if you think about it, if we are a little bit less self-consumed in terms of time frame and reflect on the challenges that ASEAN had faced over its existence since 1967, there have been many issues, and somehow the diplomacy, the diplomatic heft, the diplomatic statecraft of ASEAN member states have been able to find a way out. And this is where I think before we start tinkering with this consensus decision-making idea, we ASEAN member states need to reflect, is there room for improvement? Is it the modality, or is it the practice as currently practiced, the diplomatic efforts that's being made? I don't think it's necessarily the modality itself. And in any case, the ASEAN Charter provides that in the event of, if I'm not mistaken, in the event of a failure of a consensus, the issue can be referred to the ASEAN Summit for decisions, for the ASEAN leaders to take a decision on. So on Myanmar and its potential exclusion, I'm straight a really committed supporter of the idea of an ASEAN 10. And I'm certainly not going to allow, we shouldn't allow the action of the junta in Myanmar to jettison this project, and I would like to think they are the aberration, not Myanmar as a state itself. So I think we need to persevere. I thought an interesting and courageous move by Malaysia recently was its beginning of conversation with the NUG. I mean, I don't think, I know that there's been response from the Myanmar side describing it as irresponsible and senseless. But if you were to read the 5-point principles, there was a reference to dialogue amongst the parties concerned, or words to that effect. Surely the NUG is one of the party to be engaged in. So I hope the other ASEAN member states have the courage to follow suit on Malaysia's example.
Good. Well, you've made some important statements there. I'm sure there'll be some follow-ups on that. Let me just ask one more quick question before we turn it over to the audience for their questions. And that's on the South China Sea. And again, this is an issue that you worked very hard on with very successful, quiet diplomacy to narrow the differences between China and ASEAN on this subject. And I must say, in recent years, I think Indonesia has quite deftly shown a willingness to stand up to China in asserting Indonesia's sovereignty over, say, Natuna, protesting illegal fishing by the Chinese, and as well as illegal incursions by their coast guards, while at the same time they've been able to continue to attract Chinese investment. So they found that balance. As we look ahead now in the South China Sea, do you think there's still room for Indonesia to protect ASEAN equities in the South China Sea in 2023, or has the train already left the station there, and it's going to be difficult to reverse what has already been achieved by China in the South China Sea?
Well, Indonesia, by way of reflections and recalling, was the country that actually in the early 2000s brought the issue of the South China Sea to be discussed among regional states. That led to the Manila Declaration and then the DOC itself. I remember at the time our mindset was preventive in trying to manage the potential for conflict in the South China Sea, and the response by some of the ASEAN member states was deafening silence. Actually, they weren't that keen. Why should we discuss these issues? But in any case, thanks to Indonesia's thought leadership and initiative, there has been an ASEAN-China modality to manage the issue, the DOC 2002, and then and the subsequent efforts to have the COC realized. So I think it is important for ASEAN and China to press on and utilize that modality, the ASEAN-China process. But here, I think the key thing seems to me is the discrepancy between words and action. China speaks very eloquently and very kindly in many cases in terms of their commitment to peaceful resolution, etc., etc. But the action on the ground or at sea speaks otherwise, and there is an increasing discrepancy or gap between the diplomatic process and the situation at sea in terms of attempts to change the realities on the ground or at sea by China. And I think ASEAN member states must be persistent in highlighting that gap, because there is a real and discernible gap between actions and words. On Indonesia itself, I'm not sure. Yes, thank you for. I mean, I see your point about Indonesia standing up to China, etc. But a bit more interesting question, perhaps, Ambassador Blake, is that this issue has flared up where it wasn't before. You know, I mean, when we talk about China and the South China Sea, we know who the parties are, and Indonesia certainly isn't one of them. And through careful, deft, and calibrated diplomacy, we have been able to delineate between the ASEAN, I mean, China, South China Sea dynamic and Indonesia, China, Natuna dynamic. I'm not sure what has happened over on the management of this issue in the recent past. Now, increasingly, there is a risk of the whole thing being lumped up together, being brought all together. And I'm not sure whether this is what the situation that Indonesia wishes it to be. Especially in the early days, we were seen to be like the facilitator for the South China Sea dialogue. Now we are very much seemingly on the border, on the edges of becoming embroiled in a similar dynamics. Not least of all, I think, is the deterrence factor. Why was it China in the past a bit more holding back? You know, I mean, there were moments in 2012, the Cambodian episodes, the Cambodia, meaning that when we had the non-chairman statement, where we can see China prodding and testing, but ASEAN remained firm, even after initial difficulties. And I think that sort of put like a line that they didn't cross. But now with ASEAN being where they are, it seems to me, from the vantage point of China, it's easier in terms of setting ASEAN off one another, and the way the code of conduct has been negotiated does accentuate that point. It's as if China is dealing not with ASEAN 10, but China dealing with individual ASEAN member states. But again, back to the COC itself, I'm wondering now, although obviously this needs advancement, this needs a conclusion soon, I'm beginning to think whether is it becoming moot in the sense, because events, as I said, there is this huge discrepancy between words and actions, and perhaps the code of behavior that's needed now is not only geographic specific, it's a code of behavior basically for the entire region, because you can't be just being honest and being a good interlocutor to us.
I think that's right, because there's some questions now as to whether they will try to leverage their presence in the South China Sea to assert control over shipping or over, aerial overflights and things.
One quick point I wanted to make, Ambassador Blake, on this issue. I thought the information coming out from Manila that the Philippines is going to put forward, to recognize once again the importance of the PCA, the tribunal decision, is a very important one. And I hope our ASEAN colleagues, the other ASEAN states, notwithstanding potential dynamic between Malaysia and the Philippines in terms of their own respective claims, they can rally around to this notion and not to leave the issue, not to have like a deafening silence. I think this, if it becomes formal by the Philippines, deserve an ASEAN collective response, because silence, as we know in your trade, in the diplomatic trade, can be viewed as being acquiescence, and I think the ASEAN member states must speak up and say something on the Philippines' seeming change of position. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bob Marty, for your customary thoughtful responses to all these questions. I'm going to turn it over to Alina to moderate the discussion with some of our listeners.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Blake. That was a breathtaking capture of a few of the things that are going on in the region and the world, but there's still appetite from members of our audience tuning in. I'd encourage you to post your questions, comments, other interventions in the Q&A box. I know some have already come up in that, as well as in chat. In the spirit of inclusion, let me also encourage those who are more comfortable speaking in Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesia, to pose their questions in Bahasa Indonesia as well. I know there's at least one that has come up. I'll try my best to air those as accurately as possible. But there have been a number of questions so far about the bridging role that Indonesia can play. So perhaps I'll start with a few of those, Pak Marty. There was a question that takes us back to what Ambassador Blake initially started us off with, which is IPEF. And the question concerns whether IPEF might be synergized with the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which is of course a brainchild of Indonesia's. And can the AOIP encourage IPEF to even perhaps align with or cooperate in some way with, for instance, the Global Development Initiative of China? We'll start with that, Pak Marty.
Well, yes. I did try to very elementarily, in a very elementary manner, try to sketch the reality that ours is a region that is actually congested with not only region-wide economic framework initiatives, but also various Indo-Pacific visions and plans and outlooks. I remember back in 2012 or 2013 when I spoke at CSIS in DC, on the issue on the Indo-Pacific at the time, certainly within ASEAN, there was a lacune of formal perspective on the Indo-Pacific, but I'm glad that now it's no longer a question proposition to have Indo-Pacific outlook, so to speak. Yes, I think it is incumbent now for a country like Indonesia, for ASEAN, to try to find where the overlaps are. Because at the moment, I think a lot of countries are basically coming up with their proposition, with their proposals. The latest, of course, is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework by the United States. And certainly looking at the initiative, US initiative and the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, on paper, there isn't really any disconnect between the two. If anything, the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN's Indo-Pacific outlook is so extensive in terms of the areas of cooperation that one can promote. It's almost like a Christmas tree approach towards the end of the negotiations, I think, where basically each ASEAN member states put their pet project on the list of areas for cooperation. Something must be caught in that wide net. And I think the US IPF is certainly one of them. But I think it would be useful, in my view, for ASEAN when they meet in Phnom Penh this year, or Indonesia when they chair next year, to have to see where to map out all these initiatives. Where are the complementarities? Where the complementarities in terms of membership, complementarities in terms of issues, and to see where the overlaps are, and to see whether we can work hand in hand to achieve those. And we did that back in 2013, Ambassador Blake, Ambassador Merrill, with APEC, when Indonesia chaired APEC. Rather than adding to new infrastructure, new processes, we said, look, rather than adding to things, let's try to clean things up. Who is doing what and where? And I think this type of more, it needs a great deal of humility, because you don't want to, you are prevented to adding to the list. But I think the bridging approach by Indonesia is extremely important in this regard, moving forward. But I am, to be honest, as a committed ASEAN centered person, I'm a little bit concerned, to be frank, Ambassador Blake and Ambassador Merrill and Bu Nur, in terms of this perception out there that there is a Quad Plus being built. Quad plus vis-a-vis economic issues, Quad plus vis-a-vis climate issues, vis-a-vis maritime issues. We have been used to the idea of an ASEAN plus, not Southeast Asian member states as being a plus to these countries. But that's my own personal worry or concern. But to you, the question, yes, there is a real bridging role to be played, but to be in a bridging role, Indonesia must enjoy the comfort level of all countries in the region, and I hope, and I'm confident it is.
Great, thank you, Pak Mati. Maybe we can bridge over to Russia and Ukraine. There's a question about whether Indonesia can play a mediating role, if at all, between the two countries. And perhaps I can tack on another question that's related to Russia, which is whether you think Russia's relationship with Indonesia will affect Indonesia's bilateral relationships with other Western nations in terms of trade and diplomacy.
I'm not sure about, well, there are several qualities that Indonesia can try to promote. I'm not sure whether mediating is the appropriate ambition or whether simply facilitating. But you know, any role of this type, first and foremost, requires the acceptance or the comfort level of the key parties. In this case, Russia and Ukraine itself, and it can't be imposed. It can't be simply declared, but it has to be wished for and called for by the parties concerned. And I'm not. This is where I think Indonesia must calibrate its positioning. What I am a little bit concerned about, to be honest, to the question, is that Indonesia has traditionally been, as many I hardly need to emphasize, independent and active. We pursue a non-aligned foreign policy, independent and active during the Cold War and ever since. But there is a risk at the moment, and this is my own personal concern, of us defining this role as being equidistant. As long as we are in the middle, as long as we don't offend anyone, we are perfectly in the middle, equidistant from Russia, from Ukraine. But there is a risk then, instead of bebas active, it becomes neutral, neutralized even, because independent and active is distinct from neutrality. Because it's independent and active, we have a role, we have a vision, we have a principles to protect and promote, even if it means we offend, agree to disagree with some of our closest of friends. But at the moment, I'm beginning to see, I hope I'm wrong, a policy of not wanting to offend anyone, and trying to be perfectly in the middle when principles are being severely violated, as in the case of Ukraine. And I think this is where I think Indonesia can deftly calibrate its position. For instance, to speak eloquently, as it has, on the non-acceptability of violation of UN principles, charter, territorial integrity, inviolability of border and territory. At the same time, speaking of our own, of course, there is no one size fits all. Southeast Asia is different to Europe, but our own experience in this part of the world is that when ASEAN expanded at the end of the Cold War, the membership of ASEAN expanded beyond the original founding members to include Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. That expansion became the catalyst for region-wide coming together. ASEAN becomes the hub for countries like China, US, Russia, and then in Northeast Asia, the DPRK, the Republic of Korea, Japan, Russia can all meet together. So our conception is one of inclusive and common security. and I'm not sure what is the dynamic in Europe is. As, again, there's no one size fits all, and I respect fully but the situation in NATO. But at least I think there is a desperate need, in my view, at the moment for a third view. Everyone's position is becoming extremely crystallized, and none of the parties are able to reach out without being seen to be weak and being appeasing. And this is where I think a country like Indonesia can test ideas and broach ideas almost without any immediate consequence. But it requires, again, the acceptance by all the parties concerned.
Thank you, Pak Mati. There are a couple of questions about climate change. What can ASEAN do about climate change, and how do you think climate change will impact on ASEAN unity, particularly given some of the geopolitical undertones related to climate change?
Well, I think, to Ambassador Blake's point at the beginning as well about the governance, it's not climate change, I guess, is one of the most salient example of an issue that defies national solution. Over the past couple of years, we've been reminded of the pandemic, or the COVID pandemic, of how this challenge is cross-border, transnational, global in nature, and that we all must be on the same boat in trying to address the issue. And imagine climate change, I assume, would be multiple times even more existential, probably, than what we have been dealing with over the past couple of years. And that is why in the past, ASEAN, when we suggested the idea of ASEAN, the ASEAN committee in the global ASEAN in a global community of nations, the Bali Concord 3, so to speak, is precisely to deal with these sort of issues. ASEAN coming together to deal with issues of common concern such as climate change. And at the moment, I think in terms of, first of all, the recognition factor, in terms of acknowledgement whether this is an issue that needs here and now treatment, or where does it come in terms of national priorities? It's not, I assume it will be rather uneven among ASEAN member states, given the different stages of their economic development and the perception as if dealing with climate change involves sacrificing certain material economic growth ambitions. But I'm glad to see at the moment ASEAN leadership have come to recognize increasingly that actually it is possible to develop a sustainable economy that is materially beneficial to its population, at the same time environmentally sustainable. But it requires a great deal of not just institutional reform, but also the mindset reform. Because I mean, on the COVID, for instance, although all of us recognize it's a common problem, a common challenge, when it comes down to it, many of the responses have been essentially national in nature. There's been a very parochial, national-centric approach, and the regional level has not been, despite all the various important and wonderful meetings that they've had, to what extent regional commitments have been mainstream to national decision makings, that I'm not sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Pak Mati. Some questions, of course, about China and ASEAN's relationship with China. There are some who suggest that isn't it time for ASEAN to say enough is enough with China's aggressions towards the region? And why is it that Indonesia has not taken as strong a stance on what's going on with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang compared to some of the statements that Indonesia has come up with regards to the Palestinians vis-a-vis Israel?
Well, the latter question, I'm glad to defer to my current, the officials, Indonesian officials, how best to respond to that. It's certainly not in my purview, something that is not for me to explain. But certainly the main takeaway that I take from that second question is that to maintain one's credibility and reputation, there has to be some kind of consistency in approach, right? You can't be speaking in a certain way on some issues, but different way on another issue that has a commonality involved. So having a consistent principle, I guess it's best to just follow one's principle view is extremely important, so that this type of question is not actually raised or wondered upon by our third-party partners. On the first question, China's rise and increasing prominence in our region is one that is going to be a perennial, not just only challenge, but also an opportunity for countries of the region. And I think it is important for us to have a thought on how to manage it, or how to, I don't want to use the term manage, it's as if it's necessarily a problem, but how to address and respond to it. And this is where I think at the moment there is a lacunae again of thought leadership, because it's not only about China, by the way. It's not only China, US, there is India and China. India and China's relationship is extremely problematic in recent years. Even US, Russia, until just now, until Ukraine, most countries, most analysts would consider, as far as the US and Russia in this part in Asia is concerned, that's actually much ado about nothing. Not me, but some people would have been so consumed by US, China that they simply ignore these other dynamics. And I have been saying all these years that you have your India, China, you have your China, India, China, Russia, Northeast Asia, with the various permutations in Northeast Asia. So I think it is impossible to simply have a unidimensional approach, contain country A or contain country B, because it is not about balance of power, in my view. It is about dynamics of power. You need to decipher intent. What makes this country tick? What are their motivations? What are their fears and their concern? And this is where folks like Ambassador Blake and Ambassador Merrill, it's your entire career in diplomacy is about deciphering intent. And I'm not sure whether we live in a way, I think, like in a world of paradox of plenty. We have more information in terms of means, modalities, but we are not necessarily more informed. And so to the original question, I don't think the idea of containing China per se is an attractive one. In my view, what is needed is the need to have a situation where we can minimize the risk of miscalculation. You have crisis management capacity. We have efforts to reduce tensions, to commitment to the non-use of force. By the way, Russia's action in the Ukraine, that would be Russia is a signatory to the TAC, Treaty of Amity and Non-Cooperation in Southeast Asia. Of course, the theater is Southeast Asia, not Central Asia, but the principle remains. We cannot condone, wherever it is, the use of this type of action. And I find it mind-boggling that I find it a little bit frustrating that ASEAN cannot speak up on this type of issue, that this is actually a principle is being violated, and they must speak up to it. And nothing personal, nothing inimical about Russia, but it has to be said.
Well, we're running out of time, but I do want to get to some questions about ASEAN itself. You mentioned that you're a real champion of the ASEAN 10, bringing everybody together. It's an important condition for Southeast Asia's security and transformation. But given how some countries, smaller countries in Southeast Asia, feel about security more specifically, do you think that other approaches can be employed to bring some of these countries, and Myanmar and Cambodia were mentioned in the question, can bring them on board with ASEAN's decisions on some of these political and security issues more generally. And then I guess related to that is you mentioned there's a governance or a leadership deficit within ASEAN. What do you think civil society's role can be in strengthening ASEAN unity?
Well, on the first issue, I think no one is pretending or assuming that ASEAN has a commonality of interest and outlook on every issue, and including on foreign policy orientation. By the diversity of outlook is ASEAN's very DNA, including on foreign policy outlook. But the thing is, in the past, the fact that Indonesia, ASEAN brings together countries of so different foreign policy orientations was ASEAN's strength. Because then we can be multi-directional and multifaceted in our approach. We can whenever difficult moments when no dialogue was going on, for instance, a country as a pariah state as the DPRK was able to still have some kind of a informal communication within ASEAN framework, ASEAN Regional Forum with its neighboring countries, for instance. But in the past, the variation of ASEAN's foreign policy outlook was ASEAN's strength. We are risking at the moment a situation where that reality is becoming its weakness, where it's as if there is no more a common principles that we can all rally around together. And I think this is where Indonesia's role in 2023 will be extremely important. There is really actually in my book, there is really not a small and a large ASEAN member states, to be honest, because we just have ASEAN member states, whatever their population size, their geographic size, they're all sovereign and equal and must be respected. But Indonesia must earn its leadership, its much proclaimed and wished for leadership role must be earned. That is how, over the years, ASEAN initially was described as being strictly a pro-West institution, organization, but then gradually we steer it to the middle to become a little bit more independent in its outlook. That is why Indonesia steered ASEAN towards the idea of ASEAN political security community, pushing our agenda at the same time maintaining ASEAN unity. Just now, Ambassador Blake mentioned vis-a-vis Myanmar. I think this is the trick and the capacity that Indonesia must try to harness, how it can project its expectations and its hopes, but at the same time not bring the entire ASEAN home down. As we are on the issue, you mentioned about the membership. ASEAN 10 to me is invaluable. It has to be protected. If anything, now I think the idea of an ASEAN 11 Timor-Leste's membership is way overdue. Ambassador Blake, I don't recall whether you were in Jakarta at the time when Indonesia hosted APEC in 2013. We hosted an informal retreat involving the Pacific Island states at the sideline of APEC. The countries involved, if I'm not mistaken, were I took it down somewhere. Where it is? There was Fiji, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, and Solomon Island. And in 2012, we wholeheartedly supported Timor-Leste membership of ASEAN. To be honest, at the time, our main preoccupation was to ensure that that part of the world, the eastern part of Indonesia, doesn't become a contest ground for geopolitical dynamics between US, China, Australia, and all the things. But somehow, after 2013, that type of initiative wasn't pushed forward by Indonesia, wasn't pushed forward again by the ASEAN members, by the APEC member states, and Timor-Leste's own admission sort of like leveling off. Now, with the situation as it is now, I think it's becoming even more important for ASEAN to widen its peace regime, so to speak, to the wider region, to quickly embrace Timor-Leste in its fold. It won't be a perfect community, but it is a process, not an event. And I cite those examples, whether it be that issue or the South China Sea or Myanmar, to remind ourselves is, as far as Indonesia is concerned on ASEAN, we have always been anticipatory. We have always looked beyond our immediate championship year. We want to influence the dynamics for the next 10, 20 years to come, not to simply become a very efficient and a very pleasant and a very hospitable host of the summit. And I hope with time coming soon, with the ASEAN summit coming, ASEAN 2023 coming up, Indonesia, I'm sure, is preparing well for this conference. But I wanted to end, as I know the time is extremely limited, to once again very quickly pay tribute to Yusindo, pay tribute to ASPI, especially the figure of Mr. Merrill and Mr. Blake and Ibu Nur, yourself, for all your thought leadership, partnership, and engagement with Indonesia and with the region. Thank you for having me this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Marty. If there's anybody who has shown thought leadership, it's yourself. It's always a treat to listen to you, and we thank you for your time. Wish we had a few more hours with you, but let me turn this over back to Ambassador Merrill.
Thank you, Alina. Minister Natilagawa, Ambassador Blake, thank you so much for your stimulating and thoughtful remarks at this historic time for Indonesia and the world. Indonesia and all of us need the best context and insights on the issues of this year and next. And we have gotten quite a few today that we would not otherwise have gotten. Yusindo and ASPI and our audience all thank you for making this time available. Good morning and good evening. Have a nice day, a nice evening. Thanks.
Thank you, Pak Marty.
We see you all again soon.
Have a good trip.
Bye.
Bye-bye.